Well, welcome this afternoon. It's good to see a full crowd, a busy floor, and I think a great day to this point. We've had a great conference kickoff and follow through, and today we have a panel this afternoon at 2:30 that I think is exactly right for what we've heard throughout the sessions to this point. I'm privileged and not unafraid to introduce my boss. Bob Shea is, I knew him first as a J6 on the Joint Staff in charge of Command, Control, Communication, Computers, C4 for the Joint Staff. I knew him as a tremendous leader of that staff and frankly a great ally as we were putting things together at the time in Joint Forces Command. But also Bob has been a leader at all ranks as a communicator in the Marine Corps and as a Marine. In command and staff positions from top to bottom throughout his service. It's evident in the way he's led AFCEA. He's been with us about 2 years and can't be more interested than the topic we're discussing today. Cybersecurity, the gaps and seams, how do we solve those problems? And so it's a very easy moderator position for him because I know it's in his heart. But I'll tell you what, this is a panel of talent that I allow him next to introduce to you, a remarkable panel that's had a chance to be on the floor and speak and will throughout the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to our CEO, AFCEA, Bob Shea.
Thank you, Bob, and as always, you're too kind, but I appreciate the comments. These certainly are challenging times. I think if you listen, for those who had the opportunity to listen to Admiral Stavridis' talk this morning, is probably one of the most compact and yet detailed and thorough presentations one's ever going to want to hear about the challenges that are going on around the world today. And if you recall, certainly one of the items he hit on was cyber. And with like a lot of new areas of warfare as they evolve, we're still in the infancy of cyber. But the problem is we can't move forward at an analog pace because we're living in a linear world that is certainly going a lot faster than we tend to be able to keep up. So we really got to think about how we implement this. Concepts are being developed, strategies are being put together, but as it happens, as would happen many times, there's things that get left behind, there's gaps and seams that aren't accounted for, or there's areas that need more emphasis to be able to full out and round out the strategy as we do go forward. So today we've got a great panel here that brings a variety of experience. Every one of them on the panel has military experience, at least 20 years of military experience in active duty, so they understand the operational context in which cyber will be employed. And there's many facets to cyber, and so that's part of the challenge. You can go from the command and control structure to the operations to the attack, exploit, and certainly the defense, and they're all tied together. They have to be integrated carefully, not just with cyber, but they've got to be able to be integrated with the other capabilities that the services bring, particularly maritime services bring to the fore. So as I'd like to get on with things and open it up for questions at some point in time here, but my first panel member that we're going to introduce is the CIO, the Chief Information Officer for the Department of the Navy. He's a retired naval officer, Department CIO with the U.S. Immigration and Customs Service, DHS. He was a deputy CIO at HHS. And he's a senior privacy officer for the Department of the Navy. So he has to get involved very heavily in a lot of policy issues that are going on and that we have to deal with. And there's certainly many. And they're issues that, quite frankly, probably haven't had much previous thought on how these issues of privacy versus security would be employed up into recent years here. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Rob Foster, the CIO for the Navy, and let him give you his perspective from the policy side.
Thank you, sir. So again, Rob Foster, I've been on board since about June, and I think to identify the gaps and the seams, I wanted to start off with a scene setter. I've heard some of the presentations, but I wanted to throw out some scope and scale discussions about 900,000 people in the Department of the Navy, both active duty, reserves, and civil servants. So you're talking 900,000 as it relates to people on 124 installations globally, supporting 287 plus or minus ships and submarines, 3,700 platforms that are aviation capable, and all of that is all connected, if you will. And if you break it down to the resources, 2210s, which is cybersecurity professionals, there's about 10,259 that I could find if they were listed correctly, that are supporting that 900,000 personnel from an IT perspective. The other piece of the puzzle would be your resources as it relates to budget. So our budget, our IT budget, round numbers, $8 billion, which is about 4.7 of the total Navy's budget. And if you break that down even further into what is CapEx and OpEx, the operational is about 85%, 6.8, and the reinvestment, the capital expenditures, is about 1.2. So when we look at what we need to do and how we need to reprioritize and focus on cybersecurity, I think understanding the scope, the scale, and the magnitude of our wonderful Navy is important to know. As it relates to senior agency official, I've got quite a few titles. Privacy is one I wanted to focus on as it relates to the gaps and the seams. I think I've had my identity stolen at least twice. I'm sure many of the folks in the room have as well. There's a unique nexus between privacy and security. Where there's a privacy incident, there could be a security, and where there's a security incident, there could be privacy involved. I bring that up because as we relate to the 900,000 people and those folks that are supporting us in different platforms and different spaces, if your identity is taken, and we understand that one of the vulnerabilities is phishing attacks, the exploitation of your privacy information can actually be used against us, and that can be a threat vector that we would have to defend against. And so I bring that up as a discussion point. We have a very big organization trying to push hard on reducing the Social Security, a unique identifier that we've used on our uniforms for everyone to see. Out on our promotion boards, when you would notify who got promoted, it would be put out and you could Google it and find people's Social Security numbers. We've been working very hard to try and reduce that, and our organization and the Don CIO, as it relates to privacy, is pushing hard to educate and remediate that possible exposure to being used against us. So I would just ask you to think about privacy in your own life, privacy in your current job, and how that could be possibly exploited across the cybersecurity spectrum.
Okay, our next speaker is Vice Admiral Branch, and I'm going to tell you, you're talking about I'm a person who's got operational experience in the cockpit and afloat, and that'd be Admiral Branch here. He's been with the operating forces for a good part of his career, many of them much more than many of us have. He's been the CO of the Nimitz. Of course, he's also been part of the Vinson strike group. And he comes to us from that position, I believe now, or 7th Fleet position. Was it 7th Fleet?
Airland.
Yeah, Airland, I'm sorry. Into the position as a CIO for the Department of the Navy, or excuse me, for the Navy, and as the N2, N6 for the United States Navy. And in that role, he's got a lot on his plate as well. I'm sorry.
Okay, good afternoon. Happy to be here and discuss information warfare as it relates to cyber. I am the Deputy CNO for Information Warfare and on this panel because of the hat that's the Director of Navy Cybersecurity. We've been gaining traction over the last now 7 years or so in terms of a pursuit of information warfare and the information warfare community and making information recognizable as a warfare domain that's analogous to undersea, surface, air, and space. The bright, shiny object of cyber and the discussion of cyberspace has made it easier to get that traction, frankly, because it's recognized now as a warfighting imperative and foundational to the things that we're doing as a Navy. There are many people out there that believe, and I'm one of them, that if we don't get it right in this space, the things that we do in the other domains don't really matter because we'll lose the fight before the fight ever joins. We do that in the information warfare community by focusing on 3 pillars of information warfare: assured command and control, which helps us obviously has applications in a comms denied, degraded, or contested environment, including a contested cyber environment. We do it in terms of battle space awareness, not just the preparation of the battlefield and enemy disposition capabilities intent, but also the environmental aspects and spectrum. And we do it with integrated fires, which is our non-kinetic effects like electronic warfare and kinetic effects that were extensions of those non-kinetic actions. I mentioned the bright and shiny object that is cybersecurity. We've done a lot of work on the N2 and 6 staff trying to focus Navy's efforts in terms of enhancing our cyber awareness and cybersecurity. We've partnered with our operational partners, 10th Fleet primarily, in the person of Jan Tai here in Fleet Cybercom, and also and importantly with all the systems commands, NAVSEA, NAVAIR, NAVFAC, NAVSUP, in ensuring that the things that we're building and buying, we're moving towards a place where we can build cybersecurity in instead of bolting it on at the end. I have to take my hat off to Dave Lewis and SPAWAR here in San Diego for leading the Information Assurance and Information Technology Tactical Advisory Board, the IAIT TAB, which is turning out specifications and standards to help with that effort. So we're pursuing a defense in depth for Navy. It's a work in progress. We started with the transport layer and the kind of the outer shell of our network because there were things, there were tools, there were things we could do to harden that outer shell and give us space and time to get farther into the network and get the sensing, the situational awareness, and the segmentation capabilities that we needed to truly defend from a cyber standpoint. It's a work in progress. We're also rolling out Cyber Safe, which is an extension of that effort and an effort to build in cybersecurity from the requirements forward. The challenge is cultural as well as technical, and it requires education, training, and an all-hands knowledge of the problem. We need to be able to treat it in the Navy like damage control, and all hands recognize their responsibilities in that space. So I'll look forward to your questions, and I think it will be a good discussion further on.
Okay, our next speaker, thank you. Our next speaker is Vice Admiral Jan Tai, and she's the commander of U.S. Fleet Cyber Command, the 10th Fleet. And this is a woman who brings extensive background into this area as she has moved through her career. She's had tours with the Naval Security Group, with the NSA, so she certainly is attuned and aware of the challenges that are out there and that face the fleet and the command that she represents as we go forward. And she certainly has the educational background with a PhD in electrical engineering to go along with it, so she can fix it and break it as well, I'm sure. Turn it over to you, Jan.
Yes, the Navy has educated me well. Well, thank you. I wanted to make sure, I know that all services are not organized exactly the same way as we are in the Navy, so making sure you understand where my role fits into the overall cybersecurity plan. Clearly, the important work that happens at the Secretariat level and at OPNAV in terms of developing policies that are going to make us more secure, reduce the attack surface, the resourcing of the Navy networks and the Navy defenses, and the investment in the training education is incredibly important work, and our partners on the Secretariat and at OPNAV and N2 and 6 are critical in then making my job in operations all that more easy. And so what we do at Fleet Cyber, 10th Fleet, and across the enterprise is all about the operations. I have to fight with the capabilities I have. I can want and need new capabilities, and I can need them faster than anybody could ever deliver. And but I have to fight with what I have, and one of the key elements in that is the innovative workforce that we have that finds ways to leverage, as in many of our domains, finds ways to leverage the capabilities that we do have to address what we're seeing in adversary threat. But in that, I also have to be able to identify what are the gaps and seams in capabilities that would make us faster to be able to respond in machine time, which is the pace at which this domain really changes. So partnering with the echelon on what we think we need and trying to get after the resourcing for that, partnering with the systems commands to make sure that we get the censoring, the modernization in the systems to make us less vulnerable so that we have a fighting chance of defending the space. That's where we are operating, and we're working at the operational and tactical level of war And interestingly, our capabilities and the capabilities we bring from Fleet Cyber Command are integral to maritime operations globally, and all the other maritime commanders that are out there executing their missions are dependent upon ours, as Vice Admiral Branch had suggested. And so we have to work on improving our lines of communications, figuring out how we integrate and talk with those other commanders on a pretty routine basis to understand what risk they have based on cyber to their missions, while we are trying to defend globally Navy networks, communications, and space assets. We created a strategy last year, and at the time it was nested under CNO's sailing directions and the former information dominance strategy, nesting under the Navy side, pretty simultaneous to our strategy publication. SecDef came out with the 2015 DoD cyber strategy, and Admiral Rogers came out with U.S. Cyber Command's vision and guidance for the force. And so we've taken our strategy and viewed it through those lenses. We've got to be able to meet the maritime needs that are being called for within Navy channels, but also meet the joint requirements of U.S. Cyber Command and the DoD. And we're working that pretty hard. Our ability to operate the network as a warfighting platform, that is, make it available and make sure that it has the integrity that it needs, has an awful lot to do with our staff's ability to maneuver the network, make changes in the network to defeat the adversary, to be able to, for force application of the resources that we have distributed globally, to apply the right resources to the most important needs that are out there at any given time, whether it's responding to an intrusion or going on working on the mission assurance of any particular mission thread or capability or platform for that matter. And so we've got to be able to do that at Fleet Cyber Command, and we've got to continually get better at that and learn from what we're doing. And that learning is not unique inside of our own command, but we have to learn together with the other maritime commanders, the other joint service operational commanders, and the joint force above us. And so it's a pretty rapidly changing domain, and we end up executing through a task force structure at 10th Fleet and Fleet Cyber Command, and making our orders understandable to not only our subordinate task forces but to the rest of the Navy when we're directing actions on operate or defend is something that we have to get a lot better at, and it's a cooperative, interactive process with all of our mission partners out there across the Navy and the Joint Force. So that's where we sit in the overall scheme of things, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral Ty. Next up is Rear Admiral Marshall Lytle of the United States Coast Guard. Admiral Lytle is the Assistant Commandant, Command Control, Communications and Computers and Information Technology, and he's also the Commander of the United States Coast Guard Cyber Command. And in that role, in the role that he's in right now, he's got some unique challenges. He's got to work across the DoD and DHS as well. He's got some challenging missions, and missions that I think are probably underappreciated by most people, but it really is a diverse bag that he has to bring, and certainly is complicated by, as I said, the diverse missions that he has to deal with. So Admiral Lytle, if you'd take it from here.
Thank you, sir. I would be remiss if I didn't start off immediately with a shout out to AFCEA and the Institute for product placement. I don't know if any of you noticed in your official show guide, I think the Coast Guard has the biggest percentage of the picture on the front. Thank you.
That'll come back to haunt us.
On the cyber side, one of the themes here is gaps, and one of the biggest gaps we've had in the Coast Guard since we got involved in cyber was an awareness and a culture in the Coast Guard that really embraced cyber as an operational domain and brought it to our entire organization and how we did business. Last year at this event, I think I started out with talking a little bit about a draft cyber strategy we had in play and our 3 goals of defending our network, enabling operations, and protecting the maritime infrastructure. Well, since that time, last spring, late last spring, it's amazing how much more focus your organization can have once your service chief signs off on a cyber strategy as one of his, at the time, 3 main strategies for his term as the Commandant. So that brought a lot of attention to the cyber environment within the Coast Guard, which is a great thing. We started focusing on it. And then we had a couple of nationwide cyber events last spring across government, across DoD, that it brought even more focus and brought a focus on the cyber scorecard. It became sort of a cyber crisis. And we decided to never let a good crisis pass you by, as the old saying goes. And the Coast Guard, one of our main strengths is as a response organization, incident response. We are all required to know the National Response Framework, and we're required to be trained in the incident command system as we come up through our careers. So we understand that. So when a pollution incident comes along, a disaster, a hurricane, a migrant incident, we all kind of go into the mode of the National Response Framework. So we treated this cyber incident last summer as a crisis, and we stood up a National Response Framework Incident Command System Crisis Action Team within the Coast Guard to address this issue, to address how the Coast Guard was going to meet the cyber discipline needs and how we're going to meet that cyber scorecard between DoD and DHS. What that does for us, what that did for us was, A, it brought resources to bear on the problem. We got after it. We got a lot of folks involved. We got focused on the problem. We got some money out of our HOP, which is not exactly an easy thing to do, to focus on how do we get the Coast Guard to a better cyber defense posture. But to me, what the real advantage was education and awareness across the service. When we stand up this ICS structure, it's not just filled with cyber, IT, and intel people. It's filled with folks from all specialties across the Coast Guard, officer and enlisted, MKs, YNs. You go right down the road with every specialty, all kind of pile in on the organization. They understand the construct. We just threw a cyber problem at them to solve. That got them working on the problem and got a lot of folks interested and active in the cyber world. We had aviators, no offense to aviators, we had an aviator in charge of one of the response teams to go out and actually learn how to speak cyber and learn how to go out in the field and add cyber discipline to some of the organizations we have. Bosun mates, MKs, all came in as TAD as part of this organization and left to go back to their units with a new understanding of what cyber meant, how to spell it correctly, and how to take action in this world, and how to work that into their operational construct. As that moved on, we realized that we may not be exactly organized correctly, and we may not be incorporating cyber across all of our Coast Guard missions the way the other services had to date. So we actually started up a task force inside the Coast Guard a couple of months ago to look at how should we maybe change the way the Coast Guard's organized around cyber? How do we build cyber into the discipline of how we do governance in the Coast Guard? How do we treat cyber just like we treat all the rest of our mission sets and not treat it as a separate thing that we have to deal with differently? So we've got that ongoing, and we're really looking forward to the output of that task force as we get toward August so we can compare our notes with the other services and how they're stood up and how they're working around cyber. So I'm looking forward to the questions from the audience for the majority of this period. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Lytle. And down the end is Brigadier General Dennis Krall. He's the Director of C4 for the Marine Corps and the CIO for the Marine Corps. And coming into this position, General Krall has spent a considerable amount of time focused on this issue of cyber. He was the Chief of the Joint Cyberspace Center down at CENTCOM, as well as the Division Chief for the Information Operations branch down there. And he also works strategy and planning under SOCOM. So Dennis brings another different perspective, coming particularly from the joint environment and working with the Marine Corps now at headquarters as their spokesman or one of the lead spokesmen in this area. So over to you, Dennis.
Thanks, sir. You know, this is really the dream question you could think to be asked if you were ever taking a final exam, and that is identify the seams and gaps in cybersecurity. So, and even looking through this and kind of preparing for it, our biggest fear was how would we ever even get through the opening remarks? I've got 100 items on my list that could easily be argued in several different ways, but I'm going to leave you with one because I find myself increasingly coming back to this same topic no matter what we discuss, and that is the workforce. So while we talk about capabilities and we've got a floor of a lot of displays and a lot of things, it's all about our people. And I will say that the Marine Corps has spent a lot of time here in these past 6 to 8 months, maybe even longer, over the past several years, looking at what it means to build that cyber warrior, not only today, but in the future. So for those in uniform, what's the training pipeline? What do they come out with skill sets, and how do they adapt and continue on, given the changing nature of this business? The other part of that is how do we retain them once they become skilled? And I've got ideas, and the team certainly has ideas, as we've looked at ways to keep that talent pool in place where we need them, and also not to neglect our civilian workforce as well. We've started looking at ways that we can get after a zero-based workforce review. It's not clear to me in looking at our own enterprise that we are investing in the right people in the right places at the right time. We have to be very careful to make sure that it's not always about squeezing down dollars or always getting cheaper, but ensuring that our investment strategy matches the direction that we have as operational warfighters. And it's lacking in some of those areas. So the one area that I think that I would leave with that has been echoed in really all of our statements here, of all the things that I think that we've got to get right, while I wouldn't disagree with any of the technological procedure, training, and baking it in up front on how we have to consider cyber, we've got to have the right workforce to get us there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, General Crall. You know, there's one of the fundamental issues when you're starting to wrestle, particularly with a new concept, or we're talking about new warfighting domain now, or a new domain that we have to operate in, and that is the making sure that everyone is on the same sheet of paper and that we aren't talking past each other. So to that end, I listened to one of the services, and they talk about information superiority. I listen here and I hear the term information warfare. I can hearken back to several years ago when the term command and control was interpreted differently by the respective services out there. So to be able to move the discussion further, I guess the first question I'd like to tee up here, is there a common understanding of what information warfare or information superiority is across the service? I'm going to put that out to Admiral Branch to start with.
I'll start. Thanks. The short answer is no. There's not there might be understanding, but there certainly isn't a common vernacular of terms and even doctrine. CNO Richardson's campaign design tasked the Navy to go out and look at a number of things. One of those areas in the line of effort number 1, the ingrained information in warfighting, a subtask under that heading is to reconcile the terminology and the doctrine with joint doctrine and other forces so that we can all better speak the language and understand each other as we're going down that path. So that is a work in progress. As far as information superiority, information warfare, until about a month ago, information dominance, Admiral Richardson also has interesting thoughts about superiority, supremacy, and dominance, and particularly doesn't like dominance in any area. He doesn't like undersea dominance. He doesn't like air dominance, because he says that when you label an area that way, it implies that you're finished. It implies pencils down, you're done, you're dominant. And he recognizes and doesn't want that mindset. He wants everyone to embrace the idea that we have much work ahead of us across the board. So, that's an idea behind the reinforcing fires to move from information dominance to information warfare. As far as information warfare is concerned and the doctrinal underpinnings of that term, there are other people on the dais that are more capable of going down that path than me.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, I'd just like to add on to say this. I think that differences in the services are necessary is not the right word, inevitable, right? We have multiple services because we have different domains from which we're focused on. So in the maritime domain, we have necessarily organized around skill sets and missions that are more related, perhaps in the maritime domain, than maybe they are in others. And so for me, the beauty of taking on a word like information warfare to describe how we in the Navy are organizing our expertise and our thoughts, when that's not necessarily defined in joint doctrine, is not a bad thing. Yeah, I think it allows us to define what that is through what we do and why we do it. And so the service cultural sides of of how they organize and what they value organized together, I think that not having exactly common vernacular and not tying us to organizing in a particular way is not a bad thing. I think it's not a bad thing, and I think ultimately what we do will define what information warfare is, as opposed to, how we define it in words or how you might find it in joint doctrine today.
Admiral Lytle, how does that affect you when you're dealing with Homeland Security, you're working with the DOD and other parts of the government? Does that create challenges for you, or?
Actually, I go along with Admiral Ty on the, having the definition a little bit vague is not a bad thing, because especially in our case, we deal with law enforcement. So we're dealing with countering transnational criminal organizations, and how we use information to counter that battle may be a little different than some of the focuses of the other services. Each of the services brings to bear their specialty, their area of expertise. So, some of the subterms, when we get to the doctrinal definitions, a lot of the stuff, and actually we had to fight this when we were coming up with our cyber strategy. A lot of good intended coasties wanted to put new terms for cyber stuff into our cyber strategy. We went, wait, stop. We need to use some of the Joint Pub 312 stuff and some of the already predetermined stuff. Let's not make up our own storyline here. So we need to keep some of the terms the same, but the kind of the definition of some of the top-level concepts can be interpreted slightly different across the services.
One of the things I'd like to add is that piece on a lexicon. One of the dangers of making something too special is it becomes too special. And from the combatant commander's perspective, if you categorize some of these activities in maybe for organization, it certainly makes sense. But in execution, if it starts to look too different, if it starts to look like things that don't have the same language of fires and the like, it's very hard to execute. Right. And you can end up with a very well-organized, resourced apparatus that has no go. That it can't get into the normal fire cycle because it uses terminology that warfighters don't understand. It doesn't get briefed properly. It doesn't have measures of performance or measures of effectiveness in order to hold those things accountable. So to me, there really has to be a sensitivity to balance. And again, while organizing it along lines makes sense, we've got to be careful to normalize this into the way that we conduct other activities.
Okay. Well, let me ask this question. Is there a human capital plan out there that would help with the development of the workforce that is needed to address the world that we're moving into at this point in time? I'll ask that first of Rob.
So absolutely. There's a lot going on, and as we just discussed, the cyber world as it relates to the domain is, I won't say new, but it's somewhat new. We have DAWIA, which is Defense and Acquisition Workforce. So those that were contracting officers, they have training programs, they have a university, they have a lot of programs to get certified. I think that's the area that we need to work on. There's nice codes out there that OPM's working on to try and categorize our civilian workforce into specialization codes. And with those specialization codes, whether they're incident response or whether they're forensics, then you can design curricula around that, and then you can train to it and then promote through that. Because right now in the civil service 2210 parenthetical cybersecurity, that pretty much gives everybody from the FISMA compliance person all the way over to the forensic person. I would suggest to you that's a different skill set, and I think what we need to do is try and focus a little bit more, in my opinion, on training for the continuous diagnostics and mitigation, the leading indicators, and kind of get off the lagging indicators, which is more of the policy and the documentation, which is the 3-year ATO cycle. So I think there's a lot going on in that space from OMB and OPM. It's not real easy because recruit, retain, and reward of somebody that has forensic capabilities or incident response capabilities. There's poaching internally inside the department. There's poaching inside the federal government, and of course there's poaching externally because of compensation packages. So we've got to figure out how to recruit people at a higher cycle rate. We have to think about how we can reward those people in a compensation side, and then we have to retain them through some method as well. So I think it's not an easy problem, but I believe it's identified and being worked, maybe not as fast as it could be.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'll just chime in to say a human capital strategy has to be informed by strategy, right? So we have to get after and identify, again, the gaps and seams in what is preventing us from getting down the road so that we can have the strategies to deliver the types of skill sets that we have. Today, we've taken skill sets and in some cases stretched them really thin across multiple different types of roles. And so coming up with What is exactly the right, what are the right work roles across the Navy? And how are we going to man those? What's the right rating? What's the right NEC sets? All of that. We definitely have a lot of work to do there. And I think part of it is, in the execution of strategy, CNO's campaign design, all the way down through the joint force vision, and bringing that down to the level at which we fight and identifying how the skills are necessary. Our type commander, for certain, Navy Information Forces Command, will have a huge role in developing that strategy, informed by operations and TTP and everything that we're working on, on a daily basis.
How about from a Coast Guard perspective?
Yeah, we just actually came out about a month ago with a overall Coast Guard human capital strategy document that kind of talks top level of this stuff, but part of that is a sub-element that has to get at how do we develop the plan underneath that strategy, instead of strategy first. Plan underneath that strategy, how we're going to address the workforce here in this particular mission set. How do we define the cyber workforce? How do we train it? What skill sets do we have? I had a great conversation just this morning with Rear Admiral Tim Slott, who the San Diego Cyber Center, about this exact topic, is how do we match what's coming out of colleges and universities today and their skill sets available with what we need in government, what we need in industry, to make that connection between what's being produced is meeting the need. And there's a lot of perception that match is not there, but when he was doing the analysis, he came up with actually the match is pretty close. It's just not defined the same. And we can actually do a better work there with across the government, really, with defining what we need so that the universities and college system we have and the workforce can be matched to what we need.
Dennis?
Sir, I really don't have a lot to add to that strategy other than what I would look at, again, the idea of retention. I think it's fair to say that, there's a delta out there of certain skill sets. And I think that's, this becomes more of the Hunger Games for us. When you look at what Cybercom, NSA, combatant commands, the services are really going after a very similar pool of people. It becomes critical, as the Admiral was talking about, tying that to your strategy, to not just go after someone with a cyber tag, but to go after that individual who performs that specific mission set you need and tailor your retention plan around those high-demand, low-density people. Making that identification is something that we're still in the process of doing.
So in addition, go ahead, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in kind of the glass half full side of the discussion here, the efforts that the Chief of Naval Personnel is making in Sailor 2025, the efforts in the campaign design about ready, relevant learning are, I think, a good vector in terms of getting after this issue. That's at the strategic level, certainly. There are things going on at more of an operational to tactical level in terms of coding the right jobs with the right billets and making sure the tests, the advancement exams reflect the work that people do so people have the opportunity to advance. Retooling education that we do at the Center for Information Warfare for the various cyber field ratings is in progress. It's going to be an evolutionary thing, but we're making headway on that. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not we keep people in school for a long time, get them out to the fleet where they, don't use some of that training until they've forgotten it, or if we do it as needed and advance the ball that way with shorter periods of training on an as-needed basis. So I think there's good progress across all those areas to get after this problem.
So, my sense is that it's going to be very difficult to keep the workforce trained at the level it needs to be able to operate in the environment that you're going to have to operate in, because the threat comes at you from many directions. It's highly skilled, it's agile. And I guess the question that comes to mind is, are you confident that the resources for training will be made available to train the force to the same level that, say, the nuclear force is trained to be able to operate in the environment that, that you're going to be forced to operate going forward? And then it's been my experience that when budget cuts come down, it's typically to operations and maintenance, and training is often, much of the training is often rolled up into those budgets. And when the cuts come down, it's this year's dollars. So are you confident we can keep the force trained?
I'll talk to the resourcing piece of that and let Jan talk to the training of the force. As a ship CO, you learn that there's always time and money to get it right the second time. I'm hoping that we don't have to learn that lesson, but I'm afraid that we will. And we won't quite hit the mark the first time around, and we'll adjust fires, and we'll throw the extra resources or the extra technology or the extra techniques at the problem. It took us a long time to get to where we are in the nuclear world. And I'm talking nuclear in terms of nuclear propulsion and in terms of nuclear as a strategic deterrent. In those high reliability organizations, both, it was recognized from the get-go that while the chances in nuclear power, for example, the chances of something bad happening were low, the consequences of something bad happening were unacceptable. Right. We haven't quite gotten there yet in cyber, even though there's been so much attention on cyber. And there's also the problem of return on investment, and it is hugely difficult to measure objectively what you get for your next cyber security dollar. So until we can get our arms around that in some fashion with some kind of objective metrics about how do we mitigate risk, not necessarily how do we comply with policy, but how do we mitigate risk, then it's going to be hard to justify probably all the expense that we really need to outlay to make the problem better.
So you go ahead. Do you want to say something, Admiral Ty? Or?
No, I think I agree with everything that Vice Admiral Branch said. We have traditionally, I think, believed that in cyberspace, keeping our folks on mission is the best training we can have for them. Mm-hmm. In some cases, it doesn't go far enough. As our defenses improve, perhaps our force needs more of a persistent training environment that allows new and different kinds of threats that may not be getting into our networks today. So that's a good thing. That's based on defense in depth capabilities, but eventually some of these kind of threats will get in. And so are we really ready to deal with the high-end threats when they do get in? And having sort of a training environment that goes beyond what our operators, defensive operators, are dealing with on a daily basis, it takes them further to get them certified on certain mission sets that we know that they must be capable of doing. That's where a big part of the department's focus is at the highest level, U.S. Cyber Command's level, to provide that kind of persistent training environment. I don't mean to be skeptical, but I think suggesting that we will have them to the level of the nuclear trained force is probably not something I'm going to see in my lifetime. But I think there are different ways to get after the problem if we can get the demand signal right. And again, a lot of what we don't have is being able to set the demand in the right way so people can then go off and work on what's the persistent training environment going to look like. What do you need out of that? And so some of that is on the operational force to be able to describe that in a better way so that we can get after it.
You probably need to kind of first step is we got to get the force defined large enough so that we can support career paths within cyber for folks to keep them interested so when they get the skill set they can stay in that skill set and continually use it. So as we define that force grader and provide those opportunities so somebody can go cradle to grave in their career, maybe within that area so they can keep honing their skills over time as they move up through the chain. But then as Admiral Ty was mentioning, we do these incidental exercises, Cyber Flag, Cyber Guard, where we put a lot of effort into standing up the training environment. We get a lot of folks on scene. We put a big exercise together, and then everybody leaves, and we take this entire environment apart. Having that persistent training environment across the department that we can rely on so that all the service, the Joint Force Cybers, the teams, everything can go into an environment on a regular basis and train like they fight on a regular basis as opposed to just on an incidental, occasional basis for exercises is where we need to go. We're not quite there yet with that.
Okay. There was a comment made by Admiral Branch referring to risk management. So I guess the question to Rob is there an integrated risk management strategy across the Department of the Navy that takes into account the different systems commands, the operating forces, the headquarters, because if you've got one of them hanging out there or it's not well coordinated, there's the opportunity for that risk management strategy or that threat or an incident to cause significant damage to the enterprise, so to speak.
Right. I won't tread on the defense in depth from Admiral Ty, but I think the risk management framework is just that, a framework. It's not going to solve anything. I think it's going to ask questions that haven't been asked before in a different cycle of the development. And I think that's leading us to the point that says, what is the risk? We have this die cap that's been around a long time. We've got an industry that works with that. The risk management framework, I think, is a different proposed approach. And again, I want to focus on the word framework. It doesn't solve the world's problem, but it does kind of deconstruct it to ask questions throughout the different life cycles, relying upon how the network's constructed, which may or may not be asked in that risk management framework. But when you say a risk to one is a risk to all, that would be how your architecture is done, how your network's defended, as we talked about defense in depth. I look at risk management framework, which is kind of what we're trying to migrate to, as an opportunity to change some of the dialogue and the discussion where in my world, and I've seen security in some cases for at least many systems and applications has been an afterthought. It's been in compression where schedule drove everything, and we'll go ahead and do a test, and that test will be based on schedule, and it's usually the last thing after the final development is done. And so the risk management framework takes that vertical on the schedule and it spreads it across at asking those challenging questions throughout the entire developmental life cycle, in this case being for a system. And I think you'll solve the problem earlier. I think you'll, as we said, 10 cents earlier in the development cycle for security saves you a significant amount of money on the back end as opposed to trying to do it right before you go live. So I think it's a change. Other departments have been doing it for a while. It's going to take us some time to work through that, but I think that's something we need to kind of to look at and see how industry can help us migrate from what we've been doing to with the other environmentals out there, how risk management framework could assist.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. There's a limited amount of resources. We don't have all the money that we need within the government to do all the things that need to be done. We've talked about a risk management strategy, but has there been any work done to identify the critical mission threads and to allocate resources to make sure that those critical mission threads are taken care of?
Okay, I guess I'll jump on that grenade. There has been some work done when Task Force Cyber Awakening cranked up in the summer of 14. There was a lot of internal discussion about how to approach the problem. Should we do it by mission thread? Should we do it by vulnerability? How should we get at it? And I think the final answer is it's a combination of both. We found pretty quickly on that if we tried to do it by mission thread, pretty soon we found that everything in the platform that helped accomplish that mission. If we try to make things cyber secure or cyber safe by mission thread, we would have to essentially cyber safe the whole platform. Right. And it was obvious that was unaffordable and unobtainable. So we couldn't do that. So instead, we went to this more of a defense in-depth approach with CyberSafe as a component, and CyberSafe being the formation of a critical thin line of components that would allow a resiliency in the platform capability. And depending on the CyberSafe level, it would either get us home, allow us some ability to continue to communicate and fight, or perhaps be full up, depending on which system we're talking about. So it was a trade-off, a combination of both of those. All that said, I'll tell you that my understanding is that NavAir in particular is using mission threads probably more than the other SysComs to try to ensure the capabilities that they need are inherent in the platform. And the reason for that the way I understand Paul Grosslag's discuss it, is, there's one thing for an aircraft that's sitting on a carrier flight deck or sitting at an air station to be cyber secure from the standpoint of downloading its maintenance data, downloading its operational loads and platforms, or transmitting them. It's a whole other thing that the aircraft itself becomes a cyber platform when it's in flight and away from the air station. So they have to factor both of those environments in, and the only way they can do that effectively is by doing a mission thread kind of approach for cybersecurity.
Okay. I would just say from the operational capability perspective, one of the things we have been doing with the establishment of the Cyber Mission Force, and specifically the Service Cyber Protection Teams, we've aligned their missions to be oriented around the various other maritime component commanders so that we could use them for things like mission assurance for particular mission threads. So we have begun to take on requests from the NCCs, the numbered fleets, to take a look from a mission thread perspective at particular prioritized mission threads that they may have or may want us to look at. So the cyber protection team would survey all the connective tissue, go aboard and scan and take a look at where there are vulnerabilities, where there is connectivity that maybe is unnecessary. It was convenient but unnecessary. Where there are critical vulnerabilities in your BMD mission thread, or in your mission planning mission thread, or in your MOC or whatever that may be. Again, the CPTs are just really coming online. Whether we have equipped them well to do that particular mission is another question. I understand there are issues associated with, well, we want them to go further into the network than what we originally authorized. Well, authorizations are important, and before we put our tools in other parts of the network, as my team down in certification accreditation like to say, is we have to eat our own dog food. And that is, we got to make sure we've actually done the risk assessment of putting these tools into mission critical systems. And so there's some growing and learning to be done there, but we're using that CPT, CMF capacity to look at some of the mission threads. I'll tell you right now, it's way too manual and way too slow, and so we're working on the tools that would make sure that we know what that network is going in and where it's connected. In a lot of cases, you work with the actual mission owner or the network owner, and they believe that they have a good diagram of what that network looks like. And then when we get there, we find out, no, you had it about 80% right. There's all these other connections. Did you know? And so getting the tools in their hands that ahead of time, both the network owner that's actually operating that network and the team that's coming in to do an assessment of the key terrain and where the vulnerabilities are. We spend a lot less time learning about ourselves and a lot more time focusing on where the vulnerabilities are, what are the threats to accomplishing that mission. So that's kind of where we are in using our CPT capacity. And as I said earlier, that capacity is not nearly sufficient to what the other NCCs and numbered fleets would like to have us be doing, but we're going to build that as we grow, and we'll get faster at that as we have the right tools in the hands of the team members.
As we move and further develop information warfare as an operating construct, one of the things that has to happen is this whole concept and this domain needs to be integrated into the professional military education system. So my next question is, how well are we doing in integrating this into the curriculum and to get people to really understand what the capabilities as well as what the liabilities are in terms of information warfare? There are several things, there are several lessons that came out of the Cold War, and it looks like they're just beginning to resurface, such as electronic warfare. I mean, we've pretty much had it our own way over time. And another area of certainly emerging interest, and it's been out there for some time, is the availability and the problem with the RF spectrum and the ability to operate in that. And so I guess, these are critical issues that are going to have an impact on the capabilities of the operating forces. And I just wonder, my question is, how well are they being integrated into the professional military education system to not only heighten the awareness, but to increase the thought leadership that might come out of that body?
Doctor. I can start.
Okay, well, I'll give you the first shot out of the barrel. I mean, I think one of the most important factors that we on the naval side have been doing is integrating cyber into our operational level of war curricula at the War College. And so every level from the JFMIC, Joint Force Maritime Component Commander's course to the 06 level course, ELOC, that exists at Navy War College, and on down into the specific curricula that War College is providing. I think of all of that as both graduate education and JPME. We are integrating cyber into that. And operationally, my team is participating in every single one of those course offerings, which means we get to go to Newport in February. It's not fun. That's a joke. Hello. You're in San Diego. Come on. Newport in February. It's not a good place to be. So on the professional military, for all leaders, so that's the leader-focused type of education. You may be familiar with the DC-3I initiative coming out of DoD, and so it sort of categorized the different kinds of education that we need. That one I would categorize in the leader focus area, but there's a lot more to be done for the specialists, for the providers, and for the general users at the deck plate level. And we actually, in partnership across the Navy, are working on education in each of those areas. And I think we're making very good progress as part of a larger joint focus on DC-3I.
I would agree. We've got to get across all. This gets back to that culture. It's the culture of all the services. We have to change that culture to incorporate cyber into every aspect of it. When the Coast Guard, we're looking at putting some basic cyber level training at all of our session points, our commanding officers classes, and the academy program, everything. Even the juniors at the academy get a whole week of cyber training in their junior summer, just so they can understand what it is. Because everybody knows how to plot a search pattern across the Coast Guard. Everybody knows what airspeed is. Everybody knows what sea state is. But we have to have folks have a basic understanding about cyber too. So every time they plan an operation, every time they do any kind of event or work joint, they have to understand that cyber is a consideration you have to make while you're treating all the rest of the domains in that. So it's a matter of starting at the bottom, really, and getting everybody as they enter the service, getting everybody, any training they get has to have a little cyber flavor so folks understand that it goes across all missions.
I think one of the keys to add to this as well is the accountability factor. So I think we're all looking at ways to inculcate cyber hygiene into our curriculum, but really I think until we make a fundamental shift of holding people accountable for what I think to be one of the greatest threats we have, which is us, certainly almost around every corner. And the biggest threat, as I've looked at this, aren't the digital immigrants, which would be a lot of us in the room. We tend to follow rules and we tend to be careful. It's those who are digital natives that read nothing and click everything at the cyclic rate, that don't see a problem in the way that they conduct themselves because they'll join any network with any device at any time. That is really where the rubber needs to meet the road, and until we start treating those as real incidents, like we would other breaches of security, I think we'll find ourselves with a lot of teaching and a lot of training, and really not a lot to show for it.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is to open up the floor to questions. And is there, any questions you'd like to raise coming forward?
45 minutes?
Yeah, there's a microphone here. And where's the other microphone? And there's a microphone over here. Yes, sir.
Jim Patton, I'm a retired submariner. Most of what I have heard and read about cyber warfare concerns the defensive. There's a submariner who can get his antennas inside any anti-access area denial bubble and would get my antennas closer to his with a virtually unlimited amount of power, energy aboard, I'm hoping, it would appear to me I'm in the perfect position to do offensive cyber warfare if I knew what it was and how. And I'm hoping, without going into details, as much intellectual capital is being invested on how we give it to him rather than defend his thrust against us.
Yes.
Sure, I can talk just a little bit. Again, sir, as you've couched the question, there's only so much you can say about capability in this, given the classification of this conversation. Certainly a lot of effort has been given not only to the cyber mission teams, but really at the tactical level to some capabilities that would be akin to what we used to know as electronic warfare. Capability has a lot of factors that go with it, to include access, which changes on any given day. But what you'll often hear on the offensive conversation harken back to authorities. And it should never be a deterrent for us to plan and prepare. But I think as a nation, we have to become more comfortable with our capabilities in that arena before we could use that maybe in the scale that we would like to. And we also have to demonstrate our ability to contain those effects, to build that level of confidence to ensure that we're not spilling outside of the intended target.
Sergeant.
Thank you, ma'am, gentlemen. Sergeant Edon from the Marine Corps Information Operations Center. Offensive and defensive cyber capabilities are problems of physics and logic. However, the President just issued his cyber deterrence strategy, which adds that additional dimension of cognition onto it. How are the services supporting this whole of government plan to deter our enemies? And do you see a difference between deterring the PRC with 100,000 cyber warriors to non-state actors such as the ISIS, or state-supported actors such as the Syrian Electronic Army?
Okay. That's 3 sessions in a row and 3 good questions. So, I think that's a great question. I think what we have to acknowledge is that DoD has a role. It's not the only role in deterrence. And so being good partners with the rest of the interagency, being able to put capabilities on the table, to demonstrate them in a way that everyone is comfortable that we know what we're doing, we know what the effect will be, and we know, potentially what the collateral damage may be if we put options on the table that could have a deterrent effect. But again, those types of discussions are necessarily at the interagency level, at the highest levels of our government, to have those conversations, because so many other, besides Department of Defense, folks play in that space and have opinions in that space, that it takes the entire whole of government to be able to come up with that deterrent strategy, which I think is what the President is encouraging, that level of discussion. But it's a pretty, it's a graduate level discussion for certain on how you take, especially the notions of traditional deterrence as we understood them under nuclear, the threat of nuclear war, and try to apply them in cyberspace where attribution is difficult and you have lots of non-state actors with low cost of entry into this space. So it's a pretty complex problem. I think the other point when we talk about deterrence, and with cyber in mind, is how we deter aggressive cyber actions coming from other places may not be with a cyber solution. So that gets back at the whole of government approach, which is how we're taking that on.
I think it's good to note as well that one of the beauties of the way our government's aligned is the fact that we have different title authorities to get after that. This conversation has predominantly been a Title 10 kind of conversation, but tremendous amount of activity with Titles 50, 18, 22 that are extremely active. Confidence level is very high in those communities, and they've demonstrated time and time again their ability to perform when needed. And we also have several examples of one authority in supporting another one when those legal qualifications can be met. So really, I would agree that this is about synergy and about getting after these target sets in a way, and whether it be deterrence, that's almost in the eye of the beholder at times. The key is whether or not we have the capability at hand and can use that when the time is right. And I think some would argue, and probably rightly so, I would agree, that we've done quite well, but not always in the public eye.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Richard Lewis, Navy Korean veteran. Is there any documentation about the frequency of attack that might have occurred on the U.S. Navy or U.S. Marines in the past?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
I couldn't understand that either.
Documentation.
The question I'm asking is there any documentation on the frequency of actual cyber attacks on the U.S. Navy or U.S. Marines in the past?
Is there
I mean,
documentation?
unclassified.
I think part of the question, I would unpack that a bit, is when you say attack, potentially, or some type of activity, I know the Admiral here could probably attest on every morning report the number of attempted intrusions that take place. Our networks are always being probed. Our networks are always being searched for vulnerabilities. And that there's evidence of that, whether it be spear phishing or other type, of events that take place that run the gamut each and every single day. And I think you're probably privy as well to some of the open source attacks that have been made against industry, which affect the way we do business, and those are very well documented. The interesting part, though, is when you look at this civil sector, you look at basically our private sector, not all of those attacks are made public for a whole host of reasons. Embarrassment, concern, stock prices, I mean, you name it. That's where I think that it becomes sometimes a little fuzzier for us to make a determination what really took place, if we ever know at all.
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, sir, thank you for participation. In the discussion of retaining qualified sailors to operate the networks, has the consideration been given that they're very undermanned? As a former member of the inspection team for cyber, I personally saw that the ones that were out there and they're good are pulled in so many directions that they simply don't have time and they end up burning out. Is that a possible consideration to maybe allow them to just focus on IT?
Well, I think, as you likely know, most of our folks that are in the business of cybersecurity are also in the business of fleet communications and RF communications and SATCOM communications. And so we have to get after how are we going to manage this force in a way that allows us to take advantage of their expertise and is more deliberate than what we have today. For both the operations of our network and the defense of our networks. And so I think in a big way, we aren't able to quite sort the differences, we aren't able to well sort the differences of the different types of demands that we put on this force today, which results in more demands than the humans we have allocated to it could ever achieve. But in terms of the IT force, the percentage of ITs that are doing defensive cyber operations is a vast majority, less than 20% of the force. So how do you professionalize that, considering the demands of running a radio room, running a NICTAMS, those kinds of things? So we've got some human capital work, but Navy Information Forces Command is focused on that, generating that readiness, figuring out what the good career paths are, figuring out how we're going to manage the whole force. And again, the ITs are a big part of it. There is the CTN piece. There is an IS piece. There is, there's multiple different skill sets involved in getting this job done, and how we develop ISs in cyber or CTRs in cyber to do the jobs we're asking them to do, and then how we manage that force is coming on, but we're still not quite there yet.
I would add the TICOM, the Information Forces TICOM, Matt Kohler and his group down in Suffolk are taking this on, and it's not unprecedented. 4 years ago in naval aviation, there was a situation where the ragged edge of readiness was identifiably due to the fit and fill of ratings in the squadrons on the deck plates. And when that reached the right level of attention and got the right emphasis, it got fixed. And one of the results of that was the OFRP, the Operational Fleet Readiness Plan, to make that manning whole. So this will be part of it too. And again, the cyber security journey that we're on is not an old trail. You know, we've been on this seriously been on this journey only for about 3 years now, 3 or 4 years, and so it's a great issue, and Matt Kohler and his crowd are taking it on and moving out with it.
If I could add my 2 bits to this, as I'm staring at 2 of my overworked and rock star cyber people there in the middle and the back. Yeah,
Raise your
it's
hands. Where are you?
Who are you?
No,
I see him. I see those.
Higher.
There we go. But yeah, we have definitely an overwork challenge within the cyber community. As mentioned, it's not an old discipline. It's relatively new. We started up the focus on cyber in a downswing in the budget environment. So as we recognize that cyber is taking on more and more of a life of its own and getting more and more emphasis and more focus, more and more jobs, more and more effort in that vein, our resource pool has not grown. In fact, our resource pool, particularly in the Coast Guard, has shrunk over the last 5 years. So how do we accommodate growing a new mission in an environment that's overall shrinking? So as an organization, we're wrestling with how do we look at our old mission set and maybe move resources from our old mission set to the new cyber mission set to acknowledge that maybe cyber could offset some of the old missions we're doing. So yeah, it's an absolute issue that's being taken into account in how we're doing our cyber manning in the future.
I want to just interject one question, because if I don't ask this question, I'm sure Admiral Mackey will smack me in the head when we're done here. But how well are we integrating IW into wargaming and so that into actual operations, so that we really understand what the capabilities and the effects are?
Sure, I'd like to jump into that. You know, this is a two-part story for this. We do it, but to be frank, we don't do it well. And when I say we don't do it well, we don't know necessarily how to inject it properly and how to measure it. So I think if you look back in the history of some of the Marine Corps' lessons learned and some of its warfighting lab experiments, you'll find this inclusion more and more in every time we go through this drill. But again, I think it often comes a bit too late. I think that we have too many specialized white cells that play this information. And again, we end up with 2 sets of lessons learned. Lessons learned for the warfighters and then lessons learned for the IW kind of community. Hopefully we'll arrest that trend, because you have to understand how to input that, and it takes time, especially when you start thinking of things like information operations or MISO. You can't seed this late in phase 1 or phase 2. These are all phase 0 activities that condition the adversary. The access that's required to do cyber is set in phase 0. All of those things have to take place well left of bang in order to ensure that the adversary can see what you're doing, can think upon that, have a chance to work that in the cognitive space, and then act in a manner that you want them to act in. And if you can't build that in the front end of an exercise, what you end up with is a lot of anecdotal dismissals and generalizations that don't move it forward.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, but we're going to have time for one more question.
Okay, thank you, General. This is not a question, but I felt I would be very remiss if I didn't offer some information about the professional military education aspect from the joint perspective. I'm Jan Hamby. I'm chancellor of one of the colleges at National Defense University that focuses on cyberspace, and the joint staff is very intently looking at what the requirements are in the joint world for the educational piece, to the point where they had us start a pilot program for the JPME Level 2 qualification for our senior officers from the cyberspace perspective. Everything from what are the limitations and opportunities from operating from a man-made terrain to how do you build this together into a coherent, integrated operational campaign plan. So I just wanted to share with the folks out there that it's not just an issue within our sea services, it's also an issue for the joint world, and the joint staff's very serious about it. Thank you.
Well, again, I want to thank our panel members. They gave some great insights, and some of the questions were a little touchy. So I think that's important, and I want to thank them for their candor and the approach they took for providing the answers to this group. And again, if you're out there from an industry perspective, I think you can probably see some opportunities out there to go after. So again, thank the panel very much, and I'd like to present you on behalf of AFCIA and the Naval Institute these boats.
It's less than $20.
Give the panel a hand, please. Thank you.